And with the international rugby season upon us, a group of more than 100 expert researchers and clinicians from around the world, co-chaired by Professor Prof Patricios of Wits University, has used new scientific evidence and updated existing recommendations to optimize the care of athletes at all levels of participation who have or who are at risk of concussion. Professor Patricios joins us now. A very good afternoon. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Good to be chatting to you once again. So what was different about the group that you guys got together and the discussions that were had that have now led to these recommendations?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. I think, as you're probably aware, this is a process that takes place every 4 years where the evidence related to sport concussion is evaluated, and then hopefully very pragmatic advice is given to not only healthcare professionals but to the layperson as well. So what was different about this process was that methodologically, in other words, the way we went about it was slightly broader than previous years in that we embraced a greater number of people. There were about 108 people involved in this process, scientists and doctors from around the world. And the outcomes produced some new information. So if I can summarize those highlights, the first was in prevention of concussion, which many people don't think about. But the research shows that there are certain things that might help in preventing concussion. Some of those are law changes to the game, particularly to contact situations. The other information which came out of ice hockey in North America was that mouth guards might play a significant role. From rugby, we learned that doing specific exercises that involve coordination, improvements of the muscle and brain working together might help limit concussions. And we know that the sooner you have your concussion attended to, the lower the risk. So from a prevention point of view, we learned quite a lot. In terms of practical things, there are 5 new what we've called tools which come out of this consensus process. One of them is for the layperson called the concussion recognition tool. And then there are some very useful tools for clinicians, healthcare people like doctors and physios, etc., called the sports concussion assessment tools and the sports concussion office assessment tools. So those were very, very important and practical things which came out. And the other probably landmark finding from this research is that early exercise in your recovery is actually beneficial. So we've moved away from this concept of actually staying in a dark room following a concussion to saying that if you do light exercise, it may actually improve your recovery, which is something that's been a little bit of a turnaround from what's been promoted in the past.
Let's speak a little bit about the light intensity activity, because the return to education and sport in the early phases of the return to sport strategy now recommend with full sports participation usually occurring within 1 month of injury. So does that mean that following a concussion, you're saying that people should not be playing sport for a month?
Not necessarily. What the research shows is that nearly everybody returns within a month. Anyone whose symptoms are persisting greater than 4 weeks is regarded as having persistent symptoms and should receive more specialized medical attention, including very specific rehabilitation that's focused on those symptoms which they're suffering from. So that might be, for instance, poor balance, which requires some physiotherapy, guided balance exercises, etc. Most people recover sooner than that, probably within 2 to 3 weeks. But one of the points is that it's very individualized. So how you present as an individual, what your elements of risk are, what your concussion history is, and the number of different areas of the brain affected will determine how quickly you return to sport. So we don't put a figure on it. It's not 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It's how well you recover. So as part of that, as you've explained very well, is that we've put together guidelines in terms of not only returning to sport step by step, but also returning to learn. So if you're a student, how to get back into the classroom and re-expose yourself to a learning environment, because obviously the brain, its primary function is obviously to absorb knowledge and to learn in many students. So it's a stepwise process, and it has to be an individualized one.
Where do these recommendations go now? Because it wasn't just one specific sport that you were looking at. You mentioned that one of the things that needs to be looked at are the protocols within the actual game, perhaps rules within the game. So where do these recommendations go now? Is it going to be...
So the first is through the sports associations and organizations. So those are people like World Rugby, FIFA, UEFA, the NFL in America, international ice hockey leagues. So any organization which is responsible for administering sport now has access to these guidelines. They're freely available. Many of them were part of the process as attendees or observers, and now they have the information and the tools, and they will tweak those to suit their specific sport, and then, very importantly, hopefully distribute them amongst their sports. But we must remember that most of these incidents of sport-related concussion occur in an amateur environment, which might not be that organized. So it's kids that ride bicycles, it's children playing football in an informal environment, etc. And one of the important tenets of this process is that the information is freely available. So it's accessible on the internet. If one goes and looks up concussion consensus, all those tools I mentioned are available and should be utilized. And one of those, the concussion recognition tool, should become part of anybody's armamentarium who's associated with sport. Whether you're a coach or a referee or a parent, you should familiarize yourself with those protocols which are available on the internet.
I suppose, Professor, one of the key things is actually identifying concussions when they actually do happen and what the symptoms are around concussions. A very important discussion. That is Professor Patricios from Wits University. Thank you so much for speaking to us about the latest research and updated protocols around concussion in sports, Stephen.